We'd have about 12 people who are with us on Zoom to be a part of this conversation, so thank you all for sticking around and for being a part of this. As Rich just said, in case you didn't hear, for folks who are on Zoom, if you would like to speak later in the meeting when we're having some question and answer time, you can unmute yourselves and speak, and then we'll be able to see your video here in the sanctuary, and hopefully it'll feel somewhat organic in terms of being a dialogue here. So just to give people a little bit of a preview of what the plan is here, we have several of us are going to share about the work that we've been doing over the past year as the anti-racism sort of team that formed organically. And I would guess that is going to be about 20 to 25 minutes of us sharing sort of about the vision, the proposal that hopefully you got. I should have asked too, does anybody want a copy of the proposal? We're not going to really go over it in person. I don't know if you're on the list, Mark, so let me give you one. Yeah, Rachel has them if you want one. If you didn't get one, whatever. Like I said, we're not going to be presenting off of that, but it'll be good for you to have it for other reasons. And for those who are at home, this was emailed out in a special email to members of the church. And so we'll gladly share it with anyone else who maybe is sticking around but isn't a member. Just email our office, Bethel-Bethany-UCC@gmail.com, and we can get you a copy of this too if you're interested in seeing it. So like I said, we're going to present a little bit about the proposal, and then we really want to have some good conversation if there are questions about it. One of the things that we were thinking about when doing this is we understand that this is a big ask that we're asking of our congregation, which is why we wanted to do it 2 weeks before. We really wanted to do it 1 week, but then because of scheduling reasons, it ended up being 2 weeks before we actually have a meeting to vote on it. So we'll be having a congregational meeting on August 8th. You know, it could be like we present here and everybody's kind of like, oh, this is awesome. This sounds like something we should do. But we understand that it's a big thing and people may want time to think about it, talk about it, ask more questions, etc. So that's why we were doing this informational meeting. So hopefully when we meet in 2 weeks, we don't have to spend the whole time doing what we're doing today. So let me give you a little bit of background, which I already sort of started to do in the sermon today. We all know that 2020 brought a lot of increased awareness and conversations about race and racial justice, and people all over were asking questions of, what do we do? How do we respond? And so a group of people, I had mentioned it several times, like, if you're interested in thinking about this together, let's start meeting. And so probably 8 of us maybe started meeting, and we started meeting and talking about every month, and kept having sort of the same question, which again was reflected in the sermon today, that we talked about things that were going on in the world. We were reflecting together, reflecting on things we had done, and we kind of kept coming back to this question of like, what can we do? I mean, like, do we keep reading more books? Do we keep, like, that's a good thing? Is that enough? Is that what we should be doing? And so that sort of became the thing that we kept coming back to, is like, well, maybe we actually need some help to answer that question. Maybe that answer is not going to come organically out of this group, but this is a good time for us to say, there are other people who can help us answer this. And so it became more of a focus on what would it look like to hold a mirror up to Bethel-Bethany and to say, we've been talking about these issues. We understand a lot of things about racism and systemic racism, but have we ever actually done the hard work of saying, how do we fit into that picture? As a church, of course, some of that happens organically as individuals, but really, how do we as a church participate in racism and white supremacy and so on? So that became sort of the question, and there are groups throughout the country that help conduct things that are called, they have slightly different names, but basically anti-racism audits of institutions, where they bring in certain tools to help institutions assess how they are doing in dismantling racism in their institutions. So we had a lot of extensive conversations, looked into several different groups, and we'll be happy to share about any of that if you're interested in more information. But we ended up landing on a group out of Chicago, which is called Crossroads Anti-Racism Training and Organizing. And Rachel is going to share a little bit about, when she was at Chicago Theological Seminary, underwent a 2.5-day intensive training with them and found it very transformative. So we had that experience. We talked to another church who went through this process with Crossroads and heard about their experience, and ultimately decided that this was the group that we wanted to go with. So if we can put up the slide, Rich, that I have here, I understand for people, I think you can actually probably read that pretty well here in the sanctuary. So this would be a very fluid process, the proposal that we're proposing. this is a pretty good guess based on what we've been talking about what this process could look like. So the first thing that would happen is doing an Introduction to Systemic Racism workshop, which is actually the workshop that Rachel had done at Chicago Theological Seminary. And this would be open to, they refer to all stakeholders, which in our case would be anyone in our church who's interested in being a part of this process. So anyone would be invited to come and participate in this. Traditionally, it's been a 2.5-day sort of intensive workshop. Throughout the pandemic, they have adapted things to be more virtual and meet a couple hours over several weeks. So the details we would have to figure out sort of what made the most sense for our church. But that would be the first step, that everyone would participate in this workshop. And the goal of this is to build shared language, is one thing they say. So we know we're talking about the same thing when we're using some of these terms, and then also shared understanding of what are we talking about when we're talking about racism, white supremacy, and so on. So that would be the first thing. And these, just a detail is that these workshops are taught by multiracial teaching teams, which we thought was a great strength, to recognize that different people bring different experiences, and they really emphasize that, there are times when people of color break off with an instructor who's a person of color, white people go with white people, because our involvement in racism and our experiences of racism are different. So there are some things that we need to be together for, and there are some things that we need to be separate for. And so that was one piece of this Crossroads group that was appealing to us, because we recognize that while we are predominantly white, we want this to be a multiracial experience for those who are a part of our church. The second stage then would be forming an anti-racism audit task force. So this would be about 5 to 7 people who participated in that Introduction to Systemic Racism workshop, who will then continue to meet more regularly and gain additional training to conduct the audit of our church. So the first part is building the shared language and shared understanding. A small group from that will sort of learn how to do this audit process that Crossroads are experts in. And then the third part is that task force will conduct the audit. So because we've built this shared language and shared understanding together, we'll be able to do that audit more effectively, even though it's 5 to 7 people who will be doing a lot of that thinking and work. So as I said, Crossroads has several assessment tools to help our anti-racism team look at our church from a number of different angles in terms of anti-racism and evaluate ways that our culture, our practices, our procedures, our policies, and so on may be perpetuating systemic racism and could be transformed in order to better reflect our values of being an anti-racist, inclusive space. This could take about 8 to 12 months. Again, like I said, it's a fluid process that sort of as a guess. It's dependent upon the people who are doing the audit and a lot of other kind of factors. But that's a guess, that it could be 8 to 12 months. And then the congregation will participate in this through the various assessments. Like I know that one of them is a survey that will ask for as many people to participate in. I don't know all the details of the other tools that they have, but I imagine that there could be listening sessions or things like that as a part of it. So the congregation will participate by sharing information to help with the audit. And then the team will be providing updates to the congregation as it makes sense along the way. It won't be sharing the results of each individual tool, because the important thing is to wait until we can gather all the information. But we'll do our best to keep the congregation involved and updated so that everyone can feel informed about this process. The fourth step then will be gathering the results and evaluating them. So the task force will collate the data from the assessments and reflect on common themes to uncover examples of structural racism embedded in the practices of our church. And then again, this is a process that will be done by our facilitators through Crossroads, that they'll be guiding this anti-racism audit task force to do this. And then the fifth thing will be that there is a summary document that's prepared and shared with our congregation, and this will then contain the results of the audit, along with specific and measurable suggestions for ways that we can improve in being an anti-racist church. So the data will be available if people want to see all the results of these audits, but the goal is to put it in something that's understandable for as many people to see and to process and to reflect on together in this one-page summary document. And when we talked to a church in Chicago who had done this, they shared with me their one-page summary that if people are interested, I'd be willing to talk a little bit more about, but we're trying to keep this kind of concise, if that's even possible still at this point. Then the final step is to talk about strategies for implementation and changes long term. So we have this reflective document that says we've done a lot of hard thinking about our church and ways that we can improve. Now, how are we going to implement some of these strategic changes? Some of the things might be easy. We're going to just, wow, we never thought about it that way. We could change that right now in this meeting. But some of them might be longer, bigger picture issues. And the goal of this is not to see that when we hit the end date where we reveal the report, great, we did it, now we're done, but this is really thinking about how we're sort of building a new culture as a congregation and trying to be continually reflective on our commitments to anti-racism. So some of the ideas, again, this is just me, has nothing to do with Crossroads, but I was like, maybe this would mean that we're going to form a committee to oversee this work, or maybe there will be changes on the spot that we make, or whatever. There might be other possibilities for ways that we implement these things over the long term. So that's the overview. We're going to have time for questions. I know it's not crystal clear, and we'll do our best to talk about questions. But the last thing I wanted to share before we have some of the other folks from the anti-racism team share is just about the investment that this will entail. And those of you who saw the proposal are already aware of what this will be. There are obvious costs associated with a proposal of this size. I've talked a lot about the work that we'll be doing, but we'll also have people from Crossroads available with us to teach us and train us all along the way. So this is a 12 to 18-month process that they'll be with us. We, as the anti-racism team and the church council, as we've talked about this, I was very excited that people sort of reframed the idea of costs in terms of talking about it as an investment, that people really, in our leadership, view this as an investment in our church's future in terms of being here in Sherman Park, in really doubling down on this value of our congregation. So in terms of the financial investment that this would be, Crossroads works with a lot of different sizes of organizations of different sizes, and ordinarily this type of work, they charge $40,000 for this level of consulting. Because they value equity and accessibility, they have a sliding scale based on organizations' budgets. And so because of our church's budget size, they're willing to do this consulting work with us for less than $30,000. And we just rounded up and said we're hoping to raise $30,000 to do the work, with the understanding that, hey, it might be a little bit less than that. We've already received a $1,500 grant from the Wisconsin Conference of the United Church of Christ. As we've been sharing this with the anti-racism team and with our church council, people have unprompted, without prompting them, people have come forward and at this point have already pledged $10,000 to support this work as a way of showing the congregation that people are excited about this and would love to see this happen and don't want the finances to be the thing that keeps us from engaging in this work. So because we have $11,500 raised already, we are asking our congregation to commit to another $11,500. We want to try to match what's already been pledged as a way to make this work happen. And then there will be a small remainder, as I said. If it does end up being $30,000, that would be $7,000 remaining. It might be less than that. But whatever's remaining after raising the rest of the money, we would cover with the surplus that we finished in 2020. You may remember we finished 2020 with about $40,000 in surplus. And so we wanted to hold off on dipping into that for a lot of reasons, and the church council agreed that this seems like a meaningful use of some of those funds. So that's the financial investment. The other piece of this, of course, is the sort of emotional, spiritual time investment that we're asking of our congregation. This is more than just something that we're going to hopefully write a check for and then be like, yeah, we did it. We're really asking our church to engage in some hard work. And so that's another piece that we don't want to gloss over. At this time, I'm going to invite Dr. Ruth to share a little bit. We're going to have a few different people share a few minutes, and then I'll close it up and open it up to questions. So, Dr. Ruth, do you want to come and do you want to hold the mic, or do you want me to put it in the stand? You're going to sit? All right, that's fine. Here, you can sit now, then I'll put the mic in.
Good morning. Can everyone hear me with this beautiful mask on? Well, I wrote my information out. Many of you know I can talk and talk and talk. But when Pastor Thad and the team on anti-racism, we decided who was going to say what, how they were going to say it, I decided to take mine from a personal perspective. And one of the reasons is we've often talked about our church being a multicultural, multiracial, but I'm sure many of you can count visibly how many people of color that we have in our church, as well as LGBTQ, et cetera. So being black, female, as I said earlier, I'm taking this from a personal stance. And having been a member of this church, I guess I've been here about 6 or 7 years, but I've been in UCC Congregational Church since I was a child, since I was about 5 or 6. So I think I can speak on this just a little bit. I'm a product of the 60s. That's why I need to hold on to everything to get up here, see. Then I wear these cutie pie shoes, that doesn't help. But as a product of civil rights, I really thought in definitely the 21st century, it was fini. I mean, I wasn't that naive, but I didn't think we would be where we are today. Now, I have seen some remarkable improvements. I've seen things that have changed, but globally, America in particular, we're so far away from where we need to be in the center of things. So here we are again. I want to give you an example. I moved to Wisconsin. Some of you have heard this, but it's apropos for right now. I moved from Ohio, Columbus, Ohio, to Green Bay, Wisconsin. Green Bay, hear that now? 1995. And I like antiques, or at least I like to go to the stores and flea markets, et cetera. So I went to this shop in Green Bay. It was an antique store. The first time I went, it was close to the end of the day. So I just saw something I wanted. I said, I'll return. So the following week, I did just that. I went back to the store, and I think it was the owner, because it was a gentleman this time, and the name was shown on the placard outside. And I came in, I looked around, and I said, I was here last week. And the gentleman said, yes, you are the pretty little colored girl my wife talked about. And I said, well, I didn't really say anything. I just looked, because the gentleman was 6 feet tall. I looked up, and at that time, I was so many years older. And I'm saying, I hadn't heard that expression since I was a child from Washington, D.C. So I said, what do I do? Do I quickly attack? And I wasn't even thinking about a verbal attack. I was thinking about a physical attack. I had just arrived in Green Bay, been there 2 weeks. I said, you know what? I think I ought to leave this alone, never to attend the store again. And here it is, 2021, I'm still telling this story. So it really imprinted in my brain cells. So I had many opportunities to decide whether or not I would remain on the BB anti-racism team. After participating in numerous discussions and recognizing that UCC is embarking on anti-racism conversation, I decided to remain on the team. It took prayer. It took listening to other folks. It took talking to people outside of Wisconsin. And I don't know what my true mission is in life. We're all in this journey. But as long as you're here, there's something you're supposed to do. And so, because if you haven't heard it, Wisconsin is not where I thought I was going to land. I thought I was going to still be on the East Coast, but I'm here. And as I tell people, there are lessons for me to learn, but I guess there are lessons I'm supposed to share in information. So I want to say I am not the spokesperson for all people of color, and especially black people. In addition, I am not here to make anyone feel guilty. However, I do want to offer my perspective as a Christian, a Black professional, senior citizen, and female into a very complex issue. BB is in the heart of Sherman Park. This is a community of about 60 to 65% of African Americans. It's essential that BB members be willing to extend themselves as they have done and continue to educate themselves and the community through discussions on racism and anti-racism. Now, majority people must be willing to stand up and move forward with their ability to accept that their ancestors made the community what it is today. That being said, you are not your ancestors. You have an opportunity to change the results of the past and move forward. Let's look at some things. Black people, believe it or not, and I'm saying this because I'm hoping there's a person from our church listening to this. Black people discriminate against their own due to color, hair texture, education, origin of country. And do I dare say, so do other groups discriminate against their own. Yet, and Lynn can talk about this much better than I, critical race theory addresses some of the nuances that affect our society better. I'm not a scholar, by no means, on critical race theory. However, I think it is important to highlight it here. And I offer Dr. Janelle George's article, Critical Race Theory isn't a curriculum. Rather, it is a practice. She's an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's School of Public Policy. CRT acronym is an approach or lens through which an educator can help students examine the role of race and racism in American society, end of quote. It originated in the Legal Academy. Hear that? Came from law school. CRT helps us to recognize the value and center the voices of people who have historically been marginalized throughout history. We hope that through ignoring, history, that the ills of racism will go away, but it doesn't. We have to do the work of identifying the policies, practices, and conditions that will allow it to persist. We are all products of nature and nurture, where we come from and how we are raised, our experiences in life. We must listen to those individuals who have lived, hear that now, lived through the experiences. Understand the people who experience racism every day, suffer depression, alienation, certain physical illnesses, i.e., trauma, and the like. In my conclusion, by valuing diversity, its benefits help both blacks and whites live in a better society. Let's look at Dr. Charles Drew. Do you remember Charles Drew? Okay. He was the one that founded plasma, blood plasma. But then when he needed blood plasma, they didn't give it to him. We are aware of George Washington Carver, founded the peanut. And I know all of us use the peanut in various ways. And there are a lot of people, but I just highlighted these. And the one I remember, because more contemporary, is Dr. Katherine Johnson. Dr. Johnson, had it not been for her, John Glenn may still be out there circling around before he transitioned to the other world. He may still be out there in space. Don't feel guilty about what your ancestors did, as I've already said. Rather, look forward into the future. Racism is a complex construct, and we must share our experiences in order that we may benefit from one another. We must believe that all people are equal. We must have equality of opportunity and not simply equality of outcome. May our Lord God continue to help raise the consciousness of BB members as we walk in order that we may live in a life of love and truth. Amen.
Hi again. My name is Rachel Payton, and I've been a part of the anti-racism team conversations this past year. And just to share very quickly, I think the thing that keeps coming back to me from the time that I was in seminary at Chicago Theological Seminary as a Master of Divinity student, I was there from 2017 through 2020. And I did not know what I was in for when I started classes there. And I was 34 years old at the time that I began taking classes there. And there is a class that's required of all Master of Divinity students called Living into Our Commitments and Affecting Social Change. Everybody has to take this class. And it was led at the time, and I believe is still currently led by Rabbi Rachel Mikva, who puts the curriculum together. And it is through that class that I had an experience directly with Crossroads, which is the group that we're looking to work with. And I would point to that. Thad was correct that it's typically a 2.5-day experience in the training that they do. They crammed it into one day because of our schedule, the weekend we were all together in Chicago. I would point to that day and specifically that experience with Crossroads as the pivotal point and experience in my understanding of truths in the world that I had never considered or taken into account prior to that moment. It was this specific day. I can place myself in the room. I remember who was with me. I remember how I felt. And I thought, where have I been for the first 34 years of my life? And going through this kind of training and experience was hard, is not the answer to being an anti-racist person, but for me was truly the beginning of committing to practices and increased consciousness and changing the way that I live and the awareness that I have in the world because of the realities of my siblings of color and because of the history of our country, and the details of that history were put up on a wall in that training, and we could not turn away from it. And I just wanted to share that more than anything, that it was really this experience with Crossroads that I can point to that moment and say, this is where a huge part of my life started to change, and I would not change the difficulty and reality that I was confronted with, the mirror that I was asked to hold up in that space as a white person. It was hard and it was necessary. incredibly necessary. If we're talking about getting to the promised land, if we're talking about God's dream, these kinds of experiences are things that we are asked to do as people in the world, certainly as disciples of Jesus Christ. And I hope moving forward that we can all share in this experience with Crossroads. And I'm happy to answer questions or engage in conversation too with anybody. If you have questions after today, you can feel free to email or call me. I'm happy to share more about that training specifically.
Oh, I'll just follow tradition here. Feel more grounded this way. So first of all, I want to say these are some hard folks to follow because they've shared so much. So I want to take up the question. My name is Lynn Worley. I think we figured out the other day that we walked through the doors of this church to visit sometime in like 2014. And that we were looking for my husband and at that time 2 sons were looking for a new church home that was more in the city. We've been driving to a suburban church, a suburban church that had a deep commitment to multiculturalism, but we just didn't feel right. And so when we saw what the church was about, we thought, well, this seems really great. And on top of that, my kids love the coffee hour. We always have to talk about that. So when we put it to an agreement, a family vote, Bethel-Bethany was the one. And I want to say that I think that it was one of the best choices that we've made as a family in a long time. My husband and I are intentionally or unintentionally raising children who span the color line across the rainbow, black, brown, white, and becoming a multiracial family, much like the idea of what we're working on here possibly in this church, is not something that you can start on Monday and stop on Wednesday. It keeps going. And perhaps even though I had been raised in a culture of anti-racism in my own childhood family, it's different to really to live that. So I want to just take the question just really briefly, because I know we only have a couple minutes, of why institutional racism do we need to address, not just the individual. I'm so pleased that the church is considering this proposal. Our family has joined in that offer of a gift to help support it, and we hope that no matter what that means to you, that you will see how serious this is as an organization. I study how institutions change, particularly around racism. I'm doing a lot of work right now on desegregation in suburbs. And I've spent much of the last 18 months trying to help one particular suburb rework how it does many of its institutional structures to try to be a little less racist. I will share personally on Wednesday this week that I was called a number of expletives at our neighborhood farmers market because of that work. And so I want to share that it's structures like this, it's institutions that are committed to work, that create that, we'll call it perhaps brave space, that those who want to push further and confront and reject racism can come to regardless of the color of their skin and know they have a home. That's a really important reason why institutional change needs to be addressed, not just the individual. I also want to share that as you go into institutional change, it can bring the benefit, if you fully invest in it, it can bring the benefit of building trust and creating more genuine relationships, more genuine spaces where it's hard to describe until you've felt it. And I've had a couple opportunities where that's happened, where I felt that people who, as a white person, people who are black or brown have come to me and really felt like we have a genuine relationship. That's not easy to achieve, but creating an institutional structure that encourages and nurtures that is definitely an important pathway towards that kind of change. I would also add that leaning into something like this will help us to address I believe, diversity and equity on all kinds of levels once we work on this as an organization, as a church. And I think really, if nothing else, the goal of creating a more restorative space for people who either are never allowed to walk out and away from racism because they are judged in that way, or for people who are really digging their heels in to be anti-racist, that restorative space is important. Ruth hit on the crisis. It's not gone. I've been doing a lot of work recently to try to challenge this anti-CRT movement. It's serious. It's scary. There are school districts not far from where we sit that are silencing teachers, that are limiting to classes to 1 or 2 in the whole time that the kids are in school, that they can learn about racism. We are seeing a really serious, so these things will pop up, this pushback. I think it's here because we've made progress. We've done some things thanks to hard work in the last few years with this resurgence of anti-racism, these larger commitments, but there's pushback. And an institutional structure that has really tried to work through this, that's become more genuine and open with each other, it gives us a space where we can find the resources among us to challenge that kind of pushback. So finally, I'll just say as I step down from the mic, I want you to think about the children in our church, the children who live in the neighborhood, and what a project like this would say to them. How meaningful it would be for them, no matter what they look like or who they are, to be able to have an institutional structure, a space, a place, a brave space that they can be part of, that will help them to perhaps, with any luck, with any hope, that we won't keep pushing for too many more years this idea that Dr. Martin Luther King had and others, so many others in our history have shared about how important it is for us to have a place. We have trouble imagining it, but a society where the color of one's skin does not reflect on what you can do in that society and who you can be. So thanks for letting me share.
All right, we're close to being done with the presentations. I wanted to just offer a couple closing thoughts here. So just a few things that this is and that this is not. This is not a proposal that we take on a designation of calling ourselves an anti-racist church because we've completed this process. This is a proposal to begin a new phase of asking as a community what it means to be engaged in the work of anti-racism as a community of faith. This is not another program or educational opportunity, although that will be a small piece of this. This is a process that we hope will be transformative for how we act as a church and how we understand ourselves as church in this place at this time. I've mentioned a bunch of times at this point, the UCC's General Synod met last week. One of the things that was interesting to hear was that they announced that the national offices of the UCC are beginning an anti-racism audit of their offices. There's also a conference in the UCC that's beginning a process of an anti-racism audit. In many ways, we are leading the way in this work, but at the same time, we're also part of a movement of places that are seeing the importance of doing this type of internal work in order that we can reflect these values back into the world. So in closing, there is a tension that we felt in planning this proposal and this presentation because in some ways we really wanted to be super excited about it and be like, let's do it, everybody. But we also were aware that we're asking people to do something really hard. And so how do we say, this is an exciting opportunity, but let's also not forget that we're going to be asking a lot of ourselves and of this church. As Rachel and I met with the pastor from Chicago whose church had gone through this work, I so appreciated something that she said, and I will close with this. She said, this is going to be hard. Make sure to tell your church that. But anti-racism work is discipleship. The very essence of discipleship tells us that we belong to this body, to this group. It tells us that we are deeply and unconditionally loved. But discipleship also tells us that we can do better and that we can be better. So friends, this is an invitation into deeper discipleship in following Jesus on that road to the cross in our world. At this time, we'll open it up to take questions. I know there will be some, and I know I just checked with Rich a moment ago. We still have 9 people with us on Zoom. And I would like to invite the other 3 presenters to come up and we can stand up here because I don't really want it to be a feeling of me fielding all the questions. And I should also just say thank you to Ruth, to Lynn, and to Rachel for sharing. We all appreciate hearing your perspectives. Yeah. And thank you also to the other folks who are on the anti-racism team for the past year engaging in these conversations. So does anybody have any questions? Yeah, Liz. Liz, and I'm going to repeat the questions because folks who are at home won't hear them in the room. So Liz asked if there are other churches in Milwaukee who are doing this type of anti-racism audit. We do not know of any. This was a big discussion, actually, of whether we'd be best suited to partner with other congregations in trying to do this. And we ended up deciding that Bethel-Bethany is so kind of uniquely situated that we felt it was important we do this work for ourselves so the conversation doesn't get distracted with saying, how does First Congregational in Brookfield be an anti-racist church, which would be a very different conversation than we'll be having here. So I don't think Lynn knows one, yeah.
So I do know that the Unitarian Universalist Church in Brookfield did take a vote this last year, like in the last 6 months, to pursue this. They were curious to see what we were going to do too. I just know someone who's on the social justice team. So I don't have any details on that, but I do know that they've taken a vote to move in this direction to do an audit.
Yeah, thanks. Any other questions? If Rich were set up, if people on Zoom want to ask questions, a reminder that you can unmute yourself, and if you're calling in by phone, you can push *6 to unmute yourself. Marcia, yeah. Yeah, so let me just Marcia has a question about the finances. Go ahead. Right. I think that would be up for the congregation to discuss at our congregational meeting. I think we tried to... Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. Let me repeat the question. Marcia was asking if we fail, if this proposal is accepted, see you, Mark. If this proposal is accepted, then the following week after August 8, we'll send a letter out to the congregation to ask, for contributions to support this work. And Marcia's question was, if that wave, what we're hoping people will match the funds that have currently been pledged. If that does not match the $11,500, will we take out additional funds from the surplus from last year? And it's not something that we have explicitly discussed. I think that would be something that we discuss at the congregational meeting if the congregation is in support of that. Coming from my perspective, I initially was seeing this as almost providential that the first time we talked to Crossroads, they said it was going to, it's $40,000 normally. And I'm like, we had $40,000 almost exactly last year. So now I'm kind of feeling like when we presented to the council then, we were initially going to ask for less than that. And they really were like, we think that people are going to step up and respond to this. And so, like I said, some more people came forward and said, we want to increase that initial sort of matching fund to really challenge our congregation. Good question. Any other questions or comments? Yeah, so if the Crossroads was, are we good? We're just in case other people have questions?
I have another one.
Oh, okay, hang on one second. What did you just ask me? Oh, yeah, the timeline. Yeah, so Crossroads expected, as would probably be expected, has seen a huge surplus in demands for this kind of work over the past year. So Initially, they were saying that we could begin this work as soon as like late in the year or early next year, which is part of the reason why we wanted to have this conversation now rather than waiting for our normally scheduled meeting in November, because we want to at least get the ball rolling. The last time Rachel and I talked with our contact from Crossroads, they said that actually they thought that we could start as early as this fall with doing that systemic introduction to systemic racism course. So we're hoping that's, again, part of the reason why we wanted to do this as a special meeting, was understanding that the timeline could be a little bit delayed because of their needs. Marcia, yeah, you have another question. We got a mic going here.
Yeah, in conversation with the Crossroads people, okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay. Having been in conversation with the people from Crossroads, can you give examples of any concrete steps that other churches have taken following this training? Because it's kind of vague, and I can imagine some things, but there are probably lots of things that might surprise me.
I wonder, Rachel, do you want to share first and then, okay, yeah.
Specific to that question, two things come to my mind. One is that I appreciated the proposal from Crossroads because they seem so committed to looking at Bethel-Bethany as we are and saying, this is the process and these are the things that we think your specific congregation need to be aware of and perhaps can change over time. So it's not a blanketed, this is what we do everywhere, but it's really an assessment of what's going on here and then how do we move forward to become more anti-racist. And I think something that I remember from our conversation with a pastor in Chicago was that now when they sit in committee meetings, for example, they'll pull up the assessment from Crossroads and say, how are we living into these commitments that we've made, or these commitments that we want to make? Based on the feedback that Crossroads provided. So they have something to continue going back to again, this image for me that's helpful of holding a mirror up and saying, how are we really doing this? And that comes into play in practice in their gatherings with each other in a brand new way ever since that assessment took place. That's something that stood out to me.
Let me share from the one-page summary that we got from this church, which is Urban Village Church in Chicago. Some of they're a multi-site church, so some of these relate to differences between sites. So I'm kind of scanning here, but the first observation that they made was white institutional values drive decision making. And then one of the commitments or strategic changes they had was offering a transformational values workshop for leaders, which included staff, and I guess in our case it'd be like the council members, committee members, stuff like that, doing a workshop to talk about what white institutional values are and what other opportunities would be. Another one is lack of accountability to people of color and communities of color. Accountability is a big term that's used in talking about anti-racism work. Who are we accountable to? So their suggestions were build relationships with organizations and communities of color, show up and listen, and conducting a racial equity impact assessment for all of their outreach programs. They have 8 different things here. I can read more of them, but that gives you a couple specific things that they had. Yeah.
Thinking on Thad's question too that he shared in his sermon, this repeating what can we do, what can I do question that keeps coming up. For me, thinking of working with a partner organization that has so much experience and is formed because of their commitment to work with places to become more anti-racist, there's a freedom in thinking about, I want to do different and I don't know how, and I don't have all the answers. And here's an organization that also doesn't have all the answers, but is committed to working with me, with us, to figure out what this looks like. And so I think these like internal circling conversations, what do we do, what do we do, what do we do, they can continue forever until we say, we don't know what to do. And we're committed to moving forward to become more anti-racist. And here's an organization that's driven by that exact value. So that's really exciting to me to think about.
Can I have a quick? Go ahead. I want to just raise up something that came up in our team this year, which was to talk about how when we did our search and Thad came forward, that one of the priorities that a lot of people had in searching for a new person was that it would be someone who would have experience, leadership, be willing to really push forward on this deeper connection to our neighbors, to a hyper-segregated Milwaukee, and what that means. That we've had that tradition. We didn't want that to go away in our change of pastors. And I said, and others have said on this team, it's great if you have that, but Thad needs a whole structure, an institutional structure. And by going through this, we create a lot more energy and support behind his work that he has already shown since he arrived, that he is eager, willing, and very facile at doing, and connecting with the community and being on the level with our neighbors, with our colleagues of color, with other pastors, with other churches. But him going out there and doing that as a single person representative of a church that hasn't done this work is very different from him going out there as a pastor of a church that is actively engaging in this work and finding it a priority.
Any other comments or questions? All right. I don't really know. Like I said at the beginning, it's kind of weird because we're going to vote on it in 2 weeks. I think, Rich, what are the chances that we recorded this? We did record it? Oh, awesome. Because I feel like there are other people that should be a part of this conversation who maybe weren't. So we'll see about sharing a link or something to try and get more people to be able to see this before we meet again on August 8th. Thank you for your good question. Oh, yeah, Chris. Good question. Chris asked about what the August 8 meeting will look like. And I mean, I don't really know because obviously people could come with questions. Our hope was that people who were going to have strong opinions or questions or concerns would have the time to do some of that now. Obviously we're not going to cut off conversation on August 8. It's a congregational meeting where we're talking about a couple other things as well. So we're going to be voting on a small change to our bylaws, and then discussing this proposal. I think those are the only two main things on the agenda. So yeah, we'll be opening it up for conversation. And like I said, our hope was that this would be the bulk of the conversation, but obviously maybe we'll be prepared to share a little summary of what we did here, if people didn't have a chance to participate in this meeting. Does that seem reasonable? Yeah.
It's 5 to 7 members will be on the audit team.
Yep.
But the training itself will be open for the entire congregation.
Yeah. Yep.
Hopefully in person, that's the goal.
It's not clear at this point. That would be a decision so Chris was confirming the audit team or the task force, whatever we end up calling it, would be 5 to 7 people. The first thing would be the introduction to systemic racism, which would be open to as many people as who would like to participate. And they traditionally have done it in person. We would have to work that out. I don't know what Crossroads is doing these days in terms of their trainings.
And then also remember that there's many points of contact after that. And so anyone who isn't in that 5 to 7 but has energy for this work, there will be much to do, to push this forward. And part of that will be why you bring a group like this consultancy in, is because then, as Rachel was saying, they tailor those steps. As we learn more about ourselves and they learn more about us, they can help to get us to where we hope and want to be. So, it doesn't stop after that workshop. I didn't think, you weren't suggesting that, but there will be many other points of contact and opportunities, some questions, some maybe more educational opportunities. We don't know yet.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for your time and your attention here. It really is good to share this with people. We've been talking about it for many months at this point, and so it was a big buildup. We're glad to finally share it with the widest group of people we can. So thanks again for being here. Reach out, ask questions in the next 2 weeks if you have any. We really hope that people will take this seriously and join us in being excited about this opportunity. Thanks.